Welcome to The Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhti and Nate, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host. Nate Mook is a leader and storyteller who has led humanitarian organizations supporting Ukrainian civilians since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Between 2018 and 2022, Nate served as the first CEO of World Central Kitchen, WCK, leading its transformation from a small operation to a global powerhouse, raising $500 million annually. Following his tenure at WCK, Nate was appointed special advisor on Ukraine for the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, earning the Order of Merit for service to the Ukrainian people. Since 2025, Nate has brought his expertise serving as CEO of the disaster relief nonprofit All Hands and Hearts. He continues to advocate for Ukraine as co-founder of Hachiko Foundation, which supports cats and dogs affected by the war. A board member of Save Ukraine, which has rescued over 670 children abducted by Russia, as he is also an advisor to Razom for Ukraine. Nate has also worked extensively in film as a producer of the award-winning HBO documentary Baltimore Rising. He's an executive producer of the 2022 Emmy-nominated film We Feed People and director of the 2015 Undiscovered Haiti. Additionally, Nate has been involved with the TEDx program since it started in 2009, leading the TEDx Summit in Doha and organizing several conferences. For his work amplifying voices in underserved communities, he was named a Change Hero by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Nate, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us. Before we go into the nitty-gritty and we talk about very serious things, tell me a little bit about your most recent trip to Ukraine. What were you doing there? You were talking about it before the cameras were rolling. And I think just to hook our listeners and viewers, I think this is a fascinating thing that you just talked about. And I think it talks to the creativity and your unusual approach to how you deal with this horrible, horrible war in Ukraine and what you're trying to do here for the people.
Yeah, so I just got back from a couple of weeks in Ukraine, and thanks for having me here today. It's great to chat, and very important to keep Ukraine top of mind, right? In a time when there's a lot going on, and it's easy to be distracted by all of the chaos and uncertainty and instability going on right now, and it's really important that we keep talking about Ukraine. So thank you for that. So I just spent a couple of weeks in Ukraine, and I went with some of my colleagues and to go visit some of the projects that All Hands and Hearts is working on currently, going to see friends and colleagues. As you mentioned, I've been really engaged very heavily and closely in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022. And this most recent trip, one of the things we also did was we brought a magician, a guy named David Blaine, who's very well known. He's very well known for his street magic, his sleight of hand, and also kind of doing some of these crazy things. These crazy stunts where he's like suspended himself over London for 40 days with no food and things like this, been buried alive. But he went to Ukraine because one of the things that he does, which isn't, I think, very well known, is he goes here in the United States. One of the things that he does is he goes to veterans hospitals and he visits veterans and does magic for them. Yeah. And so he has really wanted to go to Ukraine to bring his skills, bring his magic to some of the Ukrainians that have been impacted by this war. We visited children who are in hospitals. We visited a prosthetics center, meeting some of the both civilians and veterans who have lost limbs. We visited teenagers who were recently evacuated and rescued from Russian territory. You mentioned Save Ukraine, who I work with. That number now is up to 1,300 children that they've been able to rescue and bring back. So David Blaine was able to go and really just kind of do his thing. And it's amazing to see, the magic. He has decks of cards and he does these tricks, and it's incredible how you see people light up. You know, forget about some of the hardship that they're facing right now, and it is transformational to really witness. And so a very small thing, right, in the grand scheme of things. We're just bringing somebody who wants to give back and do some good in Ukraine, but the way that you can sort of, I don't know, kind of bring people like to kind of a different level of like it sort of raises their their emotional feeling in the moment, and it's a very powerful thing to witness. And because also he blows your mind, right? Like I gave up trying to figure out how he was doing these tricks. I was just like, it's magic. That's it.
It is magic.
You know, people asked me, they were like, how does he do it? I'm like, it's magic. Like truly incredible stuff. He is one of the best in the world. And what I didn't realize is his mother comes from Odessa.
Oh my goodness!
So, and his daughter is named Dessa, and so he has this connection to Ukraine, a very close connection. But he hadn't been since the start of the war, because many people, you know, it's kind of a crazy place to go. They think, oh, I can't go in the middle of a war zone. And so we were able to facilitate a bit of a trip. So we did a lot more, not only that, but that was a really special thing that we were able to do, which is cool.
That's incredible. I mean, you know, you saying it's magic, for people who witness it, it is magic, right? Because I was in Ukraine, and we'll talk about it because that's where I met you. But it's really, the war is obviously happening on a battlefield, and it's physical and it's brutal, but it's also in people's heads.
Yes.
And I think Ukrainians, the reason why Ukrainians are winning is because they are winning in their heads. And this stuff, I truly think it matters, right? To be able to see something good, to forget about the brutality and horror, especially you went as Russia was preparing to launch these massive attacks. I think that's incredibly important. So thank you for the magic. Now, just going back to how we met, you know, we had coffee with Charge at DCM at the embassy, and we finished that, and you just walked in. And, you know, I saw you, we had not met before, and I said, you know, this is a guy who knows something, because he can just walk casually into a meeting with a top U.S. diplomat, and the embassy was very clear. The embassy and the folks, everyone, they relied on you, they trusted you, and I think from that point on, I was like, all right, we should definitely talk to this guy a little bit more and find out what he's doing. So tell me, we did your bio, but tell me how exactly you got engaged in Ukraine, and what are you doing these days? What are you trying to achieve there?
Yeah. So it's definitely been a long journey. You know, I went to Ukraine for the first time in 2009. I was visiting with a friend, and in the, you know, just truly to see what Ukraine was like. And it was interesting because it was early days. You know, I was looking back some old photos, and on a wall I had taken a photo, and I hadn't realized the relevance at the time, but I had taken a photo where somebody had spray painted Slava Ukraini, which has obviously been a rallying cry as part of the war, and really part of a call for the freedom and independence of Ukraine, you know, free from tyranny, and a democratic, free and now, you know, European, hopefully, Ukraine. And so I'd visited in 2009, and, you know, got my first taste of Ukraine, and I ended up going back in 2014. This was after Maidan, the revolution, but it was really right after, and I was driving through the country, and went from Kyiv and down to Odessa and onward, and so I got to see a little bit of kind of that continuation of the push for independence and democracy, and obviously 2014 was a huge moment for Ukraine, and it was also the beginning of the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You know, we talk about it from 2022, which we sort of refer to as a full-scale invasion. But of course, the invasion started in 2014, and the occupation of Crimea that continues to this day. And so I sort of was able to witness a little bit of that in the aftermath of Maidan, and to see kind of what Ukraine was going through. Both the positive of that moment in terms of the hopeful transition to a fully democratic, free country that was more aligned with Europe than it was with the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. But really, you know, 2022, I was running an organization called World Central Kitchen, and I was here in Washington. I had just been traveling the world for other disasters that had been going on. I had just gotten back from the South Pacific, where we were responding to a massive volcano eruption in Tonga, and I was watching, like everyone else, this what we now refer to as the full-scale invasion begin. And so I was thinking a lot about friends I had in Ukraine and people that I had known through the TED community. You mentioned TEDx, and friends that I had met there from previous visits, and watching this unfold on the news. And to be honest, I didn't an initial thought wasn't, I need to go there and support. I need to go there and help, because I sort of figured that this was the biggest crisis that had been facing Eastern Europe since World War II. Certainly the biggest refugee crisis of refugees fleeing. And I sort of assumed that, well, this is so massive that the powers that be will have it handled. The United Nations, the European Union, all of these folks are going to come in, and what is a small nonprofit like World Central Kitchen going to be able to really do? But as with many things, we decided to send some of our team. Like we sort of, the way that we operated at World Central Kitchen was we would just get on the ground quickly. That was our thing. We got to get on the ground. We're going to see what the situation is. You can't do it from meeting rooms and offices thousands of miles away. You have to be there on the ground. And so we sent our emergency response team that gets on the ground and to see what the situation is. And they were right on the border with Poland and Ukraine. And the day, this was within 24 hours after the invasion started, and you started to see a huge population of Ukrainians and people that were living in Ukraine or staying in Ukraine or visiting Ukraine flee the country via Poland. And my team reported back that there was really no help on the border. There was nobody, some volunteer groups from Poland were trying to help out, but there wasn't, this had really, I think in hindsight, we shouldn't have been surprised by it, but I think a lot of people just really believed that Russia would not do this. And so when it happened, I think a lot of people were caught sort of flat-footed in, oh my gosh, what do we do? And so we, as an organization, as World Central Kitchen, we said, okay, let's just start to mobilize. Let's start to see how we can help. And so we very quickly got operations up and running along all of the border crossings with Ukraine, in Poland and Slovakia and Moldova and Romania and Hungary. So we were operating, supporting all of these Ukrainians, mostly women and children, that were trying to get away from the bombing. And the early days of the war was brutal. I mean, this was when Russia was expected to take Kyiv in 3 days, right? You had global leaders telling Zelensky to run, to get out of Ukraine and leave his country to the Russians. And then, he has this famous line where he says, I don't need transport, I need ammunition.
Exactly.
And he stayed put from Kyiv. That's now become a very iconic moment. But, we sort of now 4+ years into this war, we sort of forget that in those early days, it was chaos. There was a real belief that Ukraine could fall very, very rapidly. And so you had lots and lots of people that were making sometimes 24, 48-hour, trips without food, without water, to get out of Ukraine. And so we were there almost as like a welcoming committee, right on the border, and said, you're safe, here's some food, here's some water, whatever you need. And, just a testament to our teams and volunteers and people just coming out to support. We were able to, to serve millions and millions of meals to those Ukrainians. But very quickly, we also realized that we probably could support within Ukraine. That yes, we needed to support the refugees, but what about the people that were stuck living in metro stations, hiding from the bombs? What about, all of these Ukrainians that may need support because they're just, their whole lives have been upended. And it was a bit of a sort of a crazy kind of moment in time, but we had to make the call. Do we go into Ukraine? And so I first went in on the night of February 27th. So just a few days after the war had started. And we were being told we were in touch with the U.S. military, and they were getting intel. The 82nd Airborne had intel that, maybe that the Belarusian troops were gonna come in from the north and take Lviv, and Russian troops were almost surrounding Kyiv, and they were basically, everybody was like, this situation, Ukraine could fall at any moment.
Incredible.
But we said, you know what, let's go in, let's get connected to some of the Ukrainians, and that's what we did. Was we got on the ground, we got to Lviv. That was the first city we arrived to, the closest big major Ukrainian city from Poland. We got to Lviv, we started to connect with Ukrainians, and we said, World Central Kitchen does food. It's what we did, and I said, let's get connected to some of the people who know the restaurants and the catering companies, and they know how to feed people, and say, how can we be supportive of your efforts? You guys are already doing many things to help your community. Everybody in Ukraine stepped up in those early days of the full-scale invasion, and we said, how can we help you? Let's bring resources in, let's bring our knowledge, and let's help the Ukrainians feed Ukraine. And so from there, we just, we started to kind of build up the operation. And personally, I wasn't comfortable sending my staff in because of the security risks. But I had some experience in conflict zones from my past work, and so I was able to sort of be that sort of kind of tip of the spear, so to speak, to be connected to the Ukrainians. And we ended up building a massive operation of about 4,000. We had about 4,500 Ukrainians, all Ukrainians working for us in our warehouses, in our restaurants, and delivery drivers, and within communities. And we built up this huge kind of network that started to spread all around the country. And that was just, I think, the speed at which we were able to do it, and the amount of people we were able to reach, I think was really critical in that moment, because you had a lot of, as I said just a minute ago, I thought the UN was going to be helping. I thought the EU was going to be helping, but some, or even the United States and USAID, but a lot of these organizations are not as nimble. And we as a small nonprofit could just get things done quickly. And with the support of, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, people that were donating and offering to help, we were able to do this in a way that really, I think, dramatically touched a lot of people. And in that process, I, was standing side by side with Ukrainians. And I think one of the things that, especially in the early days of the war, while, of course, Ukraine has an army, and now probably the strongest army in all of Europe because of its experience over the last 4 years, in the early days of the war, it had a very small army, it had a very small military, because it had been broken down over the years, because Russia didn't want a strong Ukrainian military. So it was systematically degraded over the years by leaders that were, and certainly, up until the 2014 revolution, but leaders who were pro-Moscow. And so, when the full-scale invasion started in 2022, everybody was sort of part of the defense of their country. So, lawyers and doctors and, journalists and people who worked in restaurants, all of a sudden they were all part of the fight. And so as a humanitarian organization coming in and working side by side with the Ukrainians, I really felt like, yes, I wasn't fighting with guns, I wasn't shooting anybody, I wasn't defending in that way, but I felt like we and our team and all of the Ukrainians that we were working with were defending Ukraine in our own way.
Very much so,
And that sort of is something that you never, that doesn't go away. And I think my time in Ukraine over the weeks and months after the full-scale invasion began, and my time, I got to Kyiv, and then I went out to Kharkiv, so I was in eastern Ukraine, side by side with Ukrainians who were supporting their communities, and that really kind of, grips you. And I realized that I needed to continue to do everything I can, because what Ukrainians were defending, what they were fighting for, were the same ideals that our country, that the United States of America was founded upon. The values of liberty and the pursuit of happiness and freedom from tyranny and democracy, and the roots that built our nation were the very things that Ukrainians were trying to hold on to build up for their own nation. And there is nothing, I think, more important than those fighting for those, defending those values and fighting for those values. And so it was like, how could you not want to support Ukraine and be tied to Ukraine in this moment in time? And that's really been the trajectory over the last 4 years, that, really an unexpected moment from thinking, the UN, the EU, they'll handle this. No
you
problem.
are UN, NEU, NUS, NUSA, it all roll into one.
It's not about, again, it's not about, those are very important institutions.
No, not to diss anyone.
No, but but at the time, we had our lane, we had our thing that we were, and I do feel like my time building World Central Kitchen at that moment, from just being, me as the only employee to building up our team, and it was almost like the 4 years prior we had been preparing for that moment when all of the things that we had that we had learned and the experience that we had built up prepared us to be able to respond at that moment in time. And so, and of course, and nowadays I'm very fortunate with the NGO I run now, All Hands and Hearts, which does a lot more than just food. We're able to touch a lot of different parts of Ukrainian society and the work that we do. And so it's nice to be able to continue to support Ukraine beyond that sort of emergency early days moment, and help Ukraine really continue on its pathway to peace and prosperity.
Nate, one promise you should make right now. Obviously, there's going to be a book based on your life, and then there's eventually going to be a movie based on your life, because it's so interesting. It's fascinating. You got to make sure that I'm in it, right? That moment where we met at the little cafe, make sure that I'm in there, because that's very, very important. Yes, but the one thing, I will ask you a question about what you gave, what we met before. We talked about what you're doing today in Ukraine, what your organization is doing today. But following that conversation, I was thinking about, I'd read this book, and I can't remember who it was, but it was an NFL coach who talked about his team, and he always said there's always a glue guy. Right? A glue guy is a person who might not be, who might not be just out there, who might not be, your quarterback, whatnot. But this is a person who just literally holds the team together. Make sure that everybody communicates to each other. Make sure that, everybody's in a good mood. Everybody, cheers everyone up. And, when everybody's down, that is the person you go to. And this is the most critical person. I can't remember. It might have been Titans. I can't remember who it was. And, when we had that meeting, I thought of you as that. And I think your organization, tell me why it's called All Hands and Hearts, first of all, but also I think what you're doing is that. You are the glue guy, or you are the glue guy in Ukraine. So tell me about what your organization is doing right now in Ukraine and all the various things, because I know it's just a broad spectrum. And what is your mindset? How do you think about it, right? Because there should be a philosophy to anything. You can't. It's a big country. It's a lot of people. You cannot help every single person. But how do you maximize your returns, right? To put it in economic terms. So tell me about your organization, tell about your glue guy function, and tell me about the philosophy of your assistance.
Yeah. So taking a step back from World Central Kitchen, after we had really focused, especially in those early days of the full-scale invasion, making sure that people had access to food, water, that they could survive. That was, those early days, that was the key thing. As Ukraine began to stabilize in terms of its own defense, it became very clear that Kyiv was not falling, that the Russian military was not as strong as perhaps the world thought it was, and that Ukrainians were not as weak as the world thought they might be. And it became very clear that we needed to start thinking about the future, that Ukraine was, even in the midst of this ongoing war, Ukrainian society has to continue functioning and growing, amidst an ongoing battle and conflict, which again, we shouldn't, as you said before, we shouldn't, kind of diminish, because it is horrific what Russia is doing, and the amount of incredibly talented, brilliant Ukrainians that are unfortunately dying every day because of this unnecessary and unprovoked conflict is really, really something tragic that should not be ignored. But at the same time, Ukraine is also continuing to rebuild itself, to innovate, to evolve as a country and modernize, which is incredible to witness for those of us that have been there and seen it firsthand. It really is truly incredible. And so coming out of that emergency phase, I really wanted to look at how I could play a role in helping sort of the next phases of Ukraine, of the work in Ukraine, the humanitarian work in Ukraine. So I ended up, one of our biggest, earliest supporters at World Central Kitchen was a philanthropist named Howard Buffett. We had connected on a trip, and he really wanted to do more for Ukraine. And he, as a single individual, has probably done more than many countries has done for Ukraine. So I had the opportunity to work closely with him for a couple of years in Ukraine, and we worked on a number of different projects. We built a food train. We built a model central production kitchen for a school system because so they could make sure they could feed the kids, and a number of different amazing things that I got to work on with Howard, and it was incredible work. And now with All Hands and Hearts, we're really looking at, where are the gaps that we can fill and move quickly. You mentioned glue. It is so important in Ukraine right now that there's all different levels of need. There are the big things that we think about that are done sort of at the government level because the scale, we've been hearing a lot about the attacks on the energy infrastructure. Russia was systematically targeting the energy grid in Ukraine, especially during a very, very cold winter, a brutal winter in Ukraine. And taking out their ability to heat and provide power. So literally Ukrainians would freeze to death. This was the idea, that if Russia can't beat Ukraine on the battlefield, can it break the spirit of Ukraine? Now, those of us that have been to Ukraine know you cannot break the spirit of Ukrainians. That is an impossible thing. But the Russians are a bit delusional about Ukrainians and they're, and not understanding the history of Ukraine, where you have not over centuries been able to break the spirit of Ukraine. But that was the idea. And so, of course, when you think about energy infrastructure, you need the United States government. You need the governments of the world to come in and provide that equipment because it costs tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. We can't do that as an NGO, and other NGOs out there can't do that type of work. But when you sort of go down, when you peel back some of the layers of the onion, you start to see there are a lot of needs and urgent needs that aren't necessarily being met because they're not so front and center. I'll give you an example. So I was recently in Kharkiv meeting with the Kharkiv governor, and Kharkiv is about 40 kilometers from the Russian border. Geographically, that makes it very hard to defend because it simply is so close that, Kyiv, they can see the missiles flying in, they can prepare, they can take them out, they can scramble things. It's very hard to defend Kharkiv because of its geographic proximity to the Russian border. So it simply cannot have a functional school system because it is too close to, you can't have kids in school because there's not enough time for them to go get into shelters because they can't prepare. Whereas in Kyiv, they have radar, they can see what's coming, they can see what drones and missiles have been fired, they can set an air raid siren and people can go underground. In Kharkiv, the air raid siren can last for the entire day sometimes. So in turn, what Kharkiv has done to adapt is schools have moved underground. And kids are going to school essentially in basements, and they've rebuilt kind of the entire school system to kind of operate underground. But part of the needs there is they need materials. They basically need to build new facilities within these underground schools. And this is, not a massive cost financially. But obviously Ukraine it's not like it has a lot of spare, budget to spend. They're spending all their budget defending and saving lives. And so things like this, unfortunately, oftentimes don't have the support that, from within. So that's where humanitarian organizations like All Hands and Hearts, we can come in and say, great, We're going to help you equip your schools, make sure kids have what they need. This is critically important to the leadership in Kharkiv, but it's not necessarily something that they can do themselves. And so that's where we're right now really focused on how can we kind of focus on these really important but smaller things that financially we can identify donors to fund, and we can't do big infrastructure that costs tens of millions of dollars, but we can do a lot of these small things that can have the day-to-day impact that are really critical for families, for kids, and so that's, I think, one of the areas that I really look at right now with our ongoing work, because the humanitarian needs are still high. Even though we don't hear about Ukraine in the news as much, obviously people aren't donating like they did in the beginning of the war, but it is so important that when you get on the ground and you start to peel back that onion of needs, you start to see, oh yeah, there's mental health support that needs to be done for children and families. There's basic services that we can provide and support with. And that, I think, is a really critical avenue and opportunity for people to continue to get involved in Ukraine. The other thing is supporting the work of some of the really critical, amazing Ukrainian organizations that have been on the ground doing the hard work from the beginning, even well before the full-scale invasion. So I'm on the board of an organization called Save Ukraine. I've mentioned they've rescued over 1,300 children now from Russian-occupied territories. We've heard all about how Russia has now essentially kidnapped what's been documented is over 20,000 children, and the Helsinki Commission has had hearings on this. Very importantly, this is a nonpartisan issue. This is overwhelmingly people in the United States understand and support that you should not be kidnapping children. I mean, full stop. This is the one issue that Vladimir Putin has been indicted for by the International Criminal Court, the ICC. So this is a really horrific thing. So Save Ukraine is doing incredible work there. But it's not only the rescuing, because you can bring the children and teenagers back, and you're dealing with children who have been brainwashed by Russia. Russia is now putting children as young as 12 into military academies. When they hit 15, they go to military training centers. And when they're 18, possibly younger, they're being deployed as soldiers for the Russian army to fight against the country in which they lived in. I mean, this is pure evil. And they're also teaching them to fly drones, the kids to fly drones. It's a video game, so they teach them to fly drones and target civilians. I mean, it's these indoctrination. So when the children and families get rescued, there needs to be a support structure around them. They need to be, they need to have the mental health support. They need to they can't just drop back into everyday life. And so these types of services are what Save Ukraine provides. Which again, this isn't like it's not the most sexy, but like it's so critical. It's critical.
Absolutely critical
to the future of Ukraine, and the amount of people that are impacted by the trauma of war. Over 100,000 Ukrainians have lost limbs. I mean, this is unprecedented. And so the amount of work, not only just obviously the prosthetics, but the adaptation of society, so people can find jobs and be able to work and get around everyday life as with disabilities. So these are all things that I think are really critical, sometimes behind the scenes, but nevertheless, I think such an important focus area to have, and something as a humanitarian organization, as a nonprofit now, we're looking at some of these things that we can move quickly on and help. We just finished a project earlier this year that we worked on over the wintertime where we collaborated with Ukrainian railways, and we built what we call invincibility railway cars. This was the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky asked that the railways build up, kind of basically provide mobile shelters where they can move these railway cars into towns where the electricity had been knocked out, or the heating had been knocked out, so families could have a safe place to go. And the railway cars functioned kind of as mobile shelters. And so so the railways came to us and they said, the president really wants to do this project. Like, we have, we're on a budget shortfall. We're trying to operate. We're trying to do what we can. We need somebody to help us do this. And we said, great. We can move quickly. We can mobilize resources. We can get you generators, Starlinks.
Amazing.
And within weeks, we had this project up and running. Ukrainian Railways provided the railway cars. We provided the children's equipment, the Starlinks, the generators. We worked with some other humanitarian partners like White Stork and World Central Kitchen. World Central Kitchen did the food. And this collaboration came together to provide a really crucial service. We had over 25,000 families that utilized these railway cars during the wintertime. And they'll probably be utilized next winter. I hope they don't, right? But unfortunately, we have to plan for that. And so that's a great example of being able to move quickly, respond to the current needs, and I think really have a tangible impact that impacts people's everyday life in a way that can be done, that's accessible, that isn't something, it doesn't require huge amounts of, we have to sit in an office and come up and spend months planning something. It's like, you know what, let's just do this and get it done.
You said, maybe some of these things are, in the background, people may not see it, might not be unsexy, but that reminded me of a story that I read about, I believe it was Taras Shevchenko. He would always give money to people who are in need. And when somebody asked him, why, this person is going to go and maybe they're going to, gamble it away, maybe they drink it away, I don't know what happens. He had told a story about how he once was walking down and somebody came up to me and asked for money. He didn't give the money. A couple days later, he learned that this person had drowned themselves and this person passed. And this is not quite a good analogy, but I think what you're doing is there's a very fine line between desperation and just this horribleness when you feel that there's no way out, and what you are doing. I think what you're doing is very tangible, is very real. And like you said, it touches people in real ways. I mean, one of the things as we're talking about the food, food is so essential, not just for your nutrition, it's for your soul. It's somebody cares for you, right? So I think everything you have done, just like you, I'm sure you've been to, when I was in Kiev, we went to a substation, we saw how Russians bombed it, and then how Ukrainians are adapting. And you can see, but it does take time. It does take, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. They're learning, they're adapting, they're incredible. But what you're doing is just that person who may be that line between desperation and continuing to want the fight, life, you are that line. And I think you're providing that assistance. And I think what you're doing is absolutely incredible. And I'm not saying it because we're recording a podcast, but I truly believe this is to be true. Which leads me to my next question. Tell me about the Hachiko Foundation.
Yes.
Dogs, cats, because only people with big hearts would do that, right?
Yeah. No, Hachiko was, this sort of unexpected initiative that came together with a colleague and a good friend of mine, Yulia, who I met when I first got into Ukraine in the first day, and she was working with a catering company in Lviv, and we got connected to Yulia through some chefs, and when I was running World Central Kitchen, and we went to her and we said, okay, we want to. I was with Jose Andres, and we were talking to Yulia, and we said, okay, what can you do? What can we? And she's like, okay, well, I think we can, we could cook 20,000 meals a day, and we were like, and Jose was like, okay, we need to cook 200,000 meals a day, and like we need to, and she was just like, obviously just these random Americans showing up to her city, being like, we want to help you do, and but she was like, great, and she jumped in, and she became my lead for World Central Kitchen in Ukraine, and now continues to run World Central Kitchen's operations in Ukraine. And we have worked together on many things over the last 4.5 years. But in late 2022, we found ourselves in newly liberated areas in eastern Ukraine. So after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and Ukraine started to really fortify, and then it was able to push forward, obviously pushed the Russians out of Bucha. We saw the horrors that took place there and around Kyiv, and the Russians withdrew. They also withdrew from the Kharkiv region, and the Ukrainians were able to beat back the Russians in villages and towns and cities in eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk region and Kharkiv area. And so we went into these communities right after liberation to see, because people had been trapped there. They were living in basements for months. They were living on nothing, on scraps and what they could. I mean, it was a really horrific situation, and so we wanted to make sure we could go in and do what we could to support. And one of the things that we recognized when we went in there was the sheer number of animals, and not sort of strays as we would consider like wild animals or strays, I mean, these were pets that unfortunately had been left behind. Maybe their families had to evacuate. Maybe their families had been killed during the occupation. But for whatever reason, they were now alone. And so we found ourselves, and obviously, we were helping the people, but we saw all of these animals, and we said, we need to do something to help the animals too. And what was so incredible about Ukraine, and you see this as you travel all around, but Ukrainians, I mean, they take care of animals who are out even in the streets, just as they would, their own. And there's been, you can see lots of Ukrainian soldiers, even at the front lines, saving the lives of cats and dogs and rescuing them, and then the battalion is caring for them in the most impossible, worst situation possible. And animals have become so important to the Ukrainian people that, and also I think it demonstrates the level of humanity in which 100%. They operate as well. And so when we were going to these liberated areas, we would meet mainly like grandmothers, babusias in Ukrainian, and these babusias had taken in lots of animals that had been left behind. And so we would meet a woman who did not have a very large house, but had, 20 dogs and 40 cats all living together. And you're like, how does this work? And oftentimes would feed those animals before she would feed herself. Incredible. And so we went in and we said, okay, what can we do to help? And it was almost on a whim. We were like, okay, let's just figure out what we can do. And I had seen an image somewhere where somebody had made sort of an outdoor kind of pet feeder, sort of what we call like a gravity feeder, where basically it's a big plumbing tube that has a little area on the bottom where a dog or a cat could eat from, and then you can fill up the tube with pet food. And just like some people who have this when they travel, it's like as their dog or cat eats, then it kind of refills itself. And so we literally went to a plumbing store in Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. This is a frontline city in Donetsk, and we like found these tubes, and we went and set up these feeding tubes. And the next morning, outside of the building of friends of ours, these dogs had lined up like in a queue to eat from one of these feeding tubes. And we took a photo of these dogs like in a queue, and these are dogs living out in the streets. And
better behaved than some metro riders here.
Yeah, indeed. And I shared this on social media, kind of on a whim, like these dogs, and it blew up. People were like, "Oh my gosh!" And we tapped into something that I hadn't really ever thought about, which is obviously pets are impacted by war just as people are, and the trauma they're experiencing, and you see this now. I mean, of course, the families that are under attack in Kyiv, or when buildings are bombed, the first responders are rescuing the cats and the dogs just as they're rescuing the humans, and they're going through this horrific, terrible situation. And I think it really resonated with me, like, oh, this is something people care about. This is something we can do to help. And people started contacting me, and they said, how can we donate to you? How can we help? And I was like, okay, if you want to donate, well, 100% of anything you donate are going to, because it's not a job, it's just, and people started sending in money. Thousands of people started sending in money to support or asking how they could help. And so what went from this sort of on a whim, small little thing turned into, we set up a proper foundation for it. We have a charity in Ukraine. We have a US 501c3 that a major law firm here in the United States was like, hey, we want to help you and help you set this up. And it was kind of incredible. And so we've built this incredible community of people that just want to help. They I'm sure they help in other ways as well, but they found, look, I I care about animals, I care about pets, I have a dog or I have a cat, or I think this is this is an area, again, we were talking about before, it's something tangible. It's something that we can do that makes a difference, not only, of course, for the animals. You're saving the lives of the dogs and the cats, and you're helping them. We also do rescues. We do sterilization. We have a team now of about 12 people, all Ukrainians. We've been able to purchase a couple of vans. We retrofitted an ambulance to be able to do some medical treatment and sterilization for some of these animals on the front lines. And so every single day, our teams are out in Kharkiv and Donetsk and Zaporizhia and Kherson, all along the front line areas in communities. And where it's not safe, we'll even, some of the military units that are stationed there will take some of the pet food and bring it to the residents that are still living there, because it may not be safe for us to have our team go in and do it. And it's been amazing. Purina, one of the pet food companies, stepped up and said, hey, we want to donate pet food to you, because we were buying all of the pet food. And so that's been helped us expand a bit. But, I think what is so incredible about it is that, and again, something I hadn't really thought about was it's a way to keep people engaged in Ukraine beyond just the everyday, what we hear about the bombing and the attacks, which obviously are horrific. But, there is something about animals and pets, because those of us that have pets or who've had pets in our lives, it's something that we have experience with. And we can almost imagine, like, oh my gosh, like imagine if my cat or dog was going through this moment. I would want to help them. And it creates an empathy
100%
connection that is so important right now with when 4.5 years into a war, it's like, and I don't blame people, right? I mean, it's hard to remain engaged in something, and when unfortunately we're in a world of where our politics is so divided, where our country is unfortunately so divided, or at least it feels like it is, even if actually we're deep down on a human level, on an American level, we're not that divided, but the powers that be and the technology has kind of torn us apart. Like, to find ways to continue to make Ukraine relevant and resonate with people, I think is so important. And so that's one of the reasons why I do it, because you might think, oh, that's so silly, sharing photos of dogs and cats from war. But actually, if it gets people to stop for a moment in their feeds on social media or in the news and say, oh, what's the story of that animal? And like, oh, that cat is so cute, or that dog. All of a sudden, we've now captured their attention. And that, I think, is an important piece. And I think the other thing is, as I was saying before, it's so important to Ukrainians that I think what you said earlier was so spot on, that in these really tough times, showing that you care, showing that people care about you and are thinking about you, is the most important thing you can do. And that was the case with World Central Kitchen, exactly as you said. Food, sure, food is calories and it keeps people functioning, but almost more importantly, food is symbolic that somebody has prepared this hot meal and handed it over to you in your moment of just deep crisis and challenge that you're in. And it uplifts you and says, you know what, maybe tomorrow will be better. And that, I think, is really kind of what we're trying to do with Hachiko as well. It's, it's a side thing. It's not a job. But what we've created, I think, looking at it, is something really special, because not only, I mean, first of all, we have a team now that can have jobs, which is great in Ukraine, very important. But also, we're going into these communities and uplifting people that are really going through the worst of it, and helping them care for their animals, provide them medicine and pet food, and dog houses and setting up feeding stations. So it's been a really unexpected but a really special thing, and again, a testament to, I can't say this enough, I know I'm here sitting talking to you, but the real heroes, of course, are the Ukrainians and my team, and Yulia and Alana and
shout out to all of them.
The Dennis in Kherson region, and I mean, all of the team that is there every single day. They don't get to, leaving Ukraine is always very hard, right? And I just got back some days ago to DC, and people ask, oh, what's it like and what's happening and this. And I will say, I think one of the hardest parts is knowing that I can come back. I can leave. I can come back to DC.
Yeah.
I can come back and sleep through the night quietly.
Yeah.
And I think we have to remember that so many of our friends and colleagues can't do that, and those that are representing the U.S. government in Ukraine can't do that.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful to everybody that that has that is willing to put themselves there to do this work, because they're really the true heroes for sure.
Being in Kiev for 3 nights, I think, and waking up every couple hours because the alarm goes off and whatnot, and then you kind of try to figure out what you need to do, and 3 days is hard. But then I'm reminded time and again, people do it every day for so many years. One of the most heartbreaking, you talked about pets and dogs, and if you're a pet parent, that hits you hard. But I'm a father to 3 boys. Anytime I see something happening to little kids in Ukraine, it just kills you, annihilates, right? You literally put yourself together again. And one of the things that really stayed with me, one of the gentlemen who was one of our bodyguards, sounds fancy, but that's part of the way U.S. government does it. A Ukrainian gentleman, we were talking, and he said, you get used to it, you do all of that, but he said the worst part, he said, my son, is 4 years old now, and now he understands what those air raid alarms are, and every time it goes off, he just starts crying. And it just breaks you, right? And people are doing it day in and day out, and it's just hats off to everyone, to U.S. government, to everyone, to all Ukrainians who are living through that, and hats off to you for doing that. I mean, you know what you're getting into, and I genuinely appreciate that. The one thing that I wanted to touch back on is, you said early on when the war started, before the war started, not a lot of people believed that Russia would do it. And I think that's part of the reason why everybody got so flat-footed on this. And then over the years of this war and before that, obviously Russia has used propaganda to an extent that I'm astonished at how successful it is, including in this country. Why do you think they can do it? I mean, it's such an obvious, you kind of zoom out, you look at it, it's such an, seemingly, right? I mean, to you and me, maybe others, maybe we're not seeing it, such an obvious case of completely unnecessary, completely unjustified, completely on a whim war that is being executed by a dictator and a free people on the other side. And you would think 100% of people who are rational, smart, understand how the world works, that would be with them. But Russia has been able to change the narratives on this war. Why do you think that's happening? And one of some of the most insidious things that you personally have witnessed as how Russia does it.
So I think there's a couple of factors here. One is that for a very long time, the United States and our allies, I think we have underestimated or underappreciated Russia's ability to perpetuate, for lack of a better term, and maybe this is what it's called now, this idea of an information war. That we have always thought of war as a very kinetic thing, right? We send our military in. You look back at, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the first Gulf War in the 90s, or with Afghanistan after 9/11. We think of war as like we're sending soldiers places. Russia thinks of war on a much deeper level. That is, and there's incredible books written on this. There's a guy named Peter Pomerantsev who has written amazing books and definitely should be on this podcast. But he has, he's an expert on understanding the disinformation and the propaganda war that Russia is able to perpetuate. And they've been doing this for a very long time, and they've gotten very good at it. And so that's one piece of it, is that I think not only were we sort of caught flat-footed in thinking that Russia would not destabilize the world order as we know it. We were like, well, Russia is too tied in to this world order now, and all of our economies are closely tied together, so they would never do something as crazy as invade an Eastern European country or a free sovereign nation like Ukraine, right? And obviously that was false. That was just completely wrong. And so, I think they had been setting the stage for that for a very long time and preparing. So we were sort of, oh no, now we have to respond to this. And they've already had decades of experience that we are now catching up to, and recognizing the scale and the scope of the infiltration, for lack of a better term, that, maybe we used to think of spies as, they pay off somebody and they're capturing private data and putting it under a park bench, and then, we think of like the Russian spies of the 80s or something. But nowadays, Russia can create chaos and exert influence through technology, through social media influencers, from buying off people, through bots, through AI, through all of these things, manipulating, and they're so good at it. So I think that's one piece of it. Yeah. I think the other piece is that, when you look at, and I'm sure my timeline will be slightly off, but generally the example I think holds true. From the moment that Adolf Hitler took power to the sort of start of what he perpetuated, and the Holocaust and all of the horrors of what he did, was about 6 years. Yeah. He had 6 years to kind of turn people to do the types of horrific things that the Nazis perpetuated. Putin has now been in power for 25 plus years, right? He has had control over the state systems, the media. He's had total control over the country for 25 years now, right? And so it's not altogether surprising, the control that he has. I think a lot of people were also like, why aren't more Russians standing up to this? Like, they see this, like, how can they? There's so much, he's had so much time to brainwash people that it's very hard now to fight against that. Yeah. And so I think those things combined have really led to a scenario where what should be very clear and straightforward, you have a sovereign, independent nation that was not offensive, that did nothing to provoke Russia, is then being invaded, and Russia is trying to take over the country. Like, is sort of, it's mind-boggling that, as you said, that anybody would somehow side with Russia on this. But I do think that, that has really distorted, Russia has been able to distort the picture in a way that there are people that truly believe that Zelensky, even though he's Jewish, is somehow a Ukrainian Nazi, right? Like, that the Ukrainian people are somehow, they were going to attack, or they were and Russia had to do this to defend the country. Yeah. People truly believe that. Yeah. Even moderates in Russia that otherwise would have not, are now so brainwashed. So I think that's a key component of it. I think the other two quick things I'll mention are that there's a, in addition to sort of the disinformation and that there was a place in which Russia was using threats of escalation to kind of give itself power. Putin thrives on fear. Right. And whether it's the United States or Europe, when we responded initially out of a place of, whoa, we want to help Ukraine, but we don't want to cause World War III. Right. So let's help Ukraine a little bit, but not enough that Russia will get upset and do something dramatic. And Putin has used that threat that, maybe we'll drop a nuclear weapon. Yeah. Maybe we can do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. Maybe we'll go invade the Baltics and Lithuania and Poland too while we're at it. Maybe when we respond out of a place of fear, that's what gives people like Putin power. Yeah. And that's enabled him to really perhaps extend this war longer than maybe it should have been. Yeah. So I think that's, and then the last thing I'll mention, which is something that's very personal to me and really just came up recently, is we shouldn't forget that as a former Soviet republic and Ukraine, especially certain areas of Ukraine, there was a lot of integration between Russia and Ukraine, of course. And Russia has used this as propaganda, as saying, oh, we need to save the Russians, quote unquote, that are in eastern Ukraine. And we're coming into eastern, this is what they said in 2014 with the initial invasion, we're going to come in and invade to save the Russians. But it was a very mixed population. That was very normal. My ex-girlfriend, she, and one of the reasons I went to Ukraine initially, the father's side of her family is from Russia, and her mother's side of her family is from Ukraine. And her grandmother lived in Kyiv, her family lived outside of Moscow, and they were very mixed. And now that family is totally divided for obvious reasons. But so Russia has been able to tap into I think especially amongst older generation, but the Russian sentiment within Ukraine, using tools like Telegram, which is a messaging application, to target people who, may have been very confused at the beginning. What's happening? I don't know what's going. Like, I thought I was pro-Russia, and now my city's being, my city of Odessa is being attacked by Russia. But what's going on? And using that to take advantage and using their long-standing expertise in this. And 2 years ago, a close friend of mine, his name was Sergei, he was the deputy mayor of Odessa, and I got to know him in the first days of the war because Odessa has about 1 million residents, and there was a big fear, and Russia was threatening to invade and by sea and by land to come in and take the city of Odessa. And so they needed to prepare with food and make sure they had stockpiles. And so we started to work with Odessa when I was running World Central Kitchen to really help shore up this in case of invasion. How do you keep 1 million people fed under occupation? So how could we do this if Russia had surrounded the city and cut off supplies? How would we do that? So we worked together and we became close friends. And 2 years ago, he was killed in a Russian missile attack. And this was something that Russia has done called a double tap, and this is a war crime. This is where basically they'll hit a target, they'll hit a missile, usually civilian, but they'll hit some like an apartment building or something, and then emergency services will come to help, firefighters, ambulances, and then when all of the people come in to help after the missile strike, they hit a second missile, and they kill all the first responders that are coming. So Sergei is the deputy mayor of Odessa. He responded. There was a missile strike in Odessa. He went and was there on the ground with ambulance, with medical workers, and Russia hit a second missile in, and he was killed. Yesterday, the Ukrainian authorities, the security services of Ukraine, announced they had arrested the person who had provided the intelligence to Russia to initiate this attack. And this gentleman was a priest.
Oh my goodness.
A priest.
Oh my God.
With the Orthodox Church, the Moscow arm of the Orthodox Church. For those that don't know, there's the Orthodox Church, there's Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but there are different components. There's a Moscow component, so this was a gentleman who was a priest within the church, within the Moscow arm of the church, and he was recruited over Telegram, and probably paid. People are struggling, so the Russians will pay people. So they probably paid him money. They probably assured him of something. They probably convinced him that and he provided coordinates, and not just for this attack, probably for other attacks too. And the Ukrainians were able to intercept some of the communications, and that's how they were able to finally identify that he had done this. And they got access to his phone, and they could see everything. But that, I think, just summarizes the insidiousness of this, that you had a priest, connected to the Russian Orthodox Church within Odessa that lived in the city, that was then collaborating with and leading to the death of, dozens of people were killed in that attack. Literally has blood on his hands. So, this is kind of what we're up against overall.
This is very visceral, and I think it's not a good example, but I think this is a perfect example of how this propaganda kills people who have grown up together, probably. Yes. And this, like you said, he literally has blood on his hands, and this is supposed to be a man of God. This is, I mean, the Moscow church. All the links. It's a separate conversation. Maybe we'll do that. But just being mindful of your time. 2 quick questions, and I would appreciate your takes, your insight on this. First one is. We have an opportunity to speak to fellow Americans, to who are following this, who might be invested in this, who might have been really invested in the beginning. But like you said, it's human nature, right? Things are happening everywhere. What should they know? Why should they continue caring? Why should they continue supporting U.S. policy that hopefully will continue even stronger to support Ukraine? And that's one part. The second part is, and can you speak to examples? You mentioned spirit, this Ukrainian spirit. The same gentleman who said his 4-year-old now, cries every night because of the alarm. He also said when the war started, the full-scale invasion started, he said, we're thinking about having a second one, and then we decided not to think about it and just do it. And he just had a baby girl, and they're raising. They're literally, like you said, they're growing. They're continuing to innovate. They continue to be. And to me, that was just such a perfect juxtaposition of that spirit, where you're facing that horror, but you say, you know what? Just to do that, just to spite you, here's what I'm going to do. Yeah. Tell me about that. What you have seen, something that uplifts your spirit, because what you do is hard, right? Something you see and you say, you know what? This is why I do what I do.
Yeah. So I'll start with that. I think now there is nothing like witnessing firsthand. I feel very fortunate in some ways that I get to, people often when I come back from a trip to Ukraine or something, like, oh my gosh, that must have been so hard. And I'm like, actually, yes, of course, there's hardships, but actually, you know how special it is to be able to get to spend time, and you've seen this on visits with the Ukrainians and talk to them, and you get inspired. You leave inspired.
You do.
And so, I mean, I've seen a number of Ukrainian friends who have had children during this time. Of course, I've seen people start new businesses, develop new businesses, expand their business. The creativity that has been, continuing to grow and just innovate and evolve over time during what is obviously a very difficult. It's very easy to just be like, this is horrible. We're under attack every day. Like, I just want to give up. I just want to. And the Ukrainians are like, nope. We're gonna continue to hold events. We're gonna hold conferences. We're gonna have weddings. We're gonna go on vacation within Ukraine. We're gonna do and obviously all within a spirit. All of those people are also doing. Everybody in Ukraine is doing something to help their country in some regard. But new restaurants opening up, which is amazing to see. You're like, new restaurants? You're like going to the hottest new restaurant in Kyiv, and you're like in the middle of air raid siren. But this type of thing, I think, really inspires me. Seeing, as you said, no matter what they're facing, the Ukrainians, it's not stopping them from living their lives. And I think they realized very early on that if they scaled back, if they stopped doing things, that's just letting Russia win. At the end of the day, right? We say that in America, right? We can't let the terrorists win, and Russia is a terrorist state.
They are,
and so we can't give in to Russia, because that is what they want. They want to break the spirit, and so I think that to me is every single day I witness it. And I was just with my friend Igor, who runs the Ukrainian Postal Service, an amazing guy, and he was showing me the new stamps, and they have. They come out with new, creative, interesting stamps all the time, which are now collectibles. Igor was actually just in Washington, D.C., launching a collaborative stamp for America's 250. So showing the collaboration between Ukraine and the U.S., and it's a beautiful stamp to celebrate America on our 250th anniversary. So cool, right? In the middle of
amazing.
Who thinks? And at the same time, the Ukrainian Postal Service is on the front lines. They're postal. They are one of the last operators in cities that are under attack, because it's how they get pensions to elderly. It's how they communicate. They communicate. His people are under attack constantly, and yet he's continuing to innovate. We see this with Ukrainian Railways. Launching new services, expanding. They're building more railway lines into Europe. They're launching new. all while in the middle of war and under attack. That to me is we can all get inspired by that. So I love that. I think the other point that you asked around people here in America, and I think there are a couple of things that I would mention, is one, that, as I said before, I wish everybody had a chance to go to Ukraine and meet Ukrainians, because
highly recommend it.
They would feel it's like seeing your brethren, right? These are people who are so aligned to American values and what we believe in, and they are like seeing a mirror image of ourselves, right? And they are smart, they are capable, they are innovative, they are amazing people, and I think we would be like, these guys are awesome. We want to. I love hanging out with Ukrainians. It's just like, it's so great. And so I think on that level, I wish everybody had a chance. And obviously, there are a lot of Ukrainian diaspora in America, and we're very fortunate. A lot of Americans have gotten to know amazing Ukrainians over the years and have supported Ukraine. So I would say that Ukrainians are just like us. They want what we want, and I think we should really see ourselves in them, just as they see us they see themselves in us as well, right? And so I think that would be that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. I think the other thing is that I know it's been 4.5 years, and I know it's hard to kind of, oh gosh, I have to hear about this again. Isn't this war over? What's going on? We have this other war now in Iran, and this and that, and but I think it's important that we try our best not to forget, not to get tired of, not to get worn down such that we can't continue to support, because even the vocal support from America is so important to the Ukrainians, to their inspiration. And that if, again, it goes back to what we were saying before, if we stop caring, then that's how the enemy wins. That's how they when we just get so tired that we give up, that's when we lose. And so we can't. If for everything that we believe in, especially celebrating 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, right? And what formed the foundation of our country. It's so important that we keep that in mind. The other thing is that I think what people should think about now, and I think we've made a lot of mistakes as a country in how we have communicated our support of Ukraine. Of course, in the early days, it was about just helping out. We need to help out. Our ally and friends were under attack by an adversary that has also attacked the United States in a lot of ways. And we needed to support, we need to help our friends, of course, in the early days. I think we need to shift that narrative now into, this isn't just about being charitable to Ukrainians and helping them out. This is in the interest of the United States of America.
It's a partnership.
We have seen firsthand the Iranian drones that were then used in Ukraine, improved by Russia tenfold, have gone back to Iran from Russia, and then have been used by Iran to kill American soldiers. Direct link to how the war in Ukraine has killed Americans and has impacted us, right, in this country. Russia is not a friend to America and hasn't been for a very, very long time. We need to recognize that they are an adversary, and we need to make sure that we take the proper approaches to how we respond to that, through sanctions, through pressure, through support of our allies who are defending themselves, like Ukraine, literally against Russia, against the ghost fleet of their ships where they're illegally selling oil and bypassing sanctions. We need to, we have to recognize that there are things that we can do and we must still do, because it is in the interest of the United States and our own security. And that Ukraine, especially of how it has gone from importing help from the outside to now exporting its own technologies to help defend against Iranian drones in the Persian Gulf, working with countries like the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia to bring its own experience and expertise. Ukrainian defense technology is now here in the United States. And we are collaborating, we are partnering, both at a government level with our Pentagon, but also with private sector
Right.
innovation. And that's wonderful because
Yeah.
Ukraine is on the forefront of the future
Yeah.
of potential war. And as we look at potential conflict in places like the Pacific, hope it doesn't happen, but as we look at Taiwan and China and other places,
Yeah.
we're seeing now what Hezbollah is doing now with the drones as well. We have to be watching this and saying we need to also be able to respond to it. And we saw firsthand what's happened with Iran when Iran attacked American bases.
Yeah.
And so again, I think we need to shift the narrative.
Yeah.
Ukraine is not a charity case. Ukraine is a valuable partner
Right.
and an asset to the United States. And we need to bring them in and welcome them and show Ukraine how America and Ukraine can be prosperous together. And so that message, I think I want to get out to the American people. So because I get it, when you're struggling, when your gas is $6 a gallon and you're struggling to keep your job or you're carrying multiple jobs and take care of your family, when you hear something like, oh, a bunch of aid is going to Ukraine, you're like, wait a minute, what about me?
Right. Right.
Totally get that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to recognize that we're not talking about cash money from the United States going to Ukraine. We're talking about collaboration, innovation. Ukraine wants to purchase. Ukraine actually wants to give us money to purchase weapons and other supplies. Ukraine will purchase air defense from the United States. So money comes back to us. And also, what we've done, again, something that hasn't been, I think, widely understood, we've been able to give Ukraine a lot of our old stuff that was expiring, our old weapons, that were sitting on shelves sometimes since the Vietnam War.
Incredible.
I mean, I was out in eastern Ukraine and visiting one of the brigades, and they had equipment. They had sort of rocket propellant, literally labeled 1968. It was sitting on shelves. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work because it was so old. But we got rid of all of our old stuff, gave it to Ukraine, and with the money that was appropriated, we bought new stuff.
Yeah.
So we didn't send cash money to Ukraine that then could have gone to Americans. We gave them our old stockpiles of stuff, and then with that money, we bought new stuff to be prepared for the future.
Win-win.
Win-win.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things. I really think we need to shift the narrative, holistically. And members of Congress are starting to do this. We're starting to see that we need to be ready and prepared. Ukraine is a national security asset to us. Ukraine is an innovation ally. Like together we can do great things.
I think just to summarize that, I think what you're saying is if you care about Ukraine for the sake of Ukraine, good, fantastic.
Perfect.
If you don't care about Ukraine, but you care about United States of America, which you're a citizen of, resident of, doesn't matter, then you should care about Ukraine.
Definitely.
That's what you're saying. Nate, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. I mean, obviously your life and what you do is inspiring, but also you represent, like you said, dozens, hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians who are doing it behind, and they maybe cannot be here with us physically, but you are representing them. And I think in that way, hopefully we're doing a little bit of a service to them as well, just by having you here. And you are doing, and into our audience and this Congress and everyone, a huge service by doing what you do. Thank you for everything you do. Let me shake your hand. And we're going to do and
Absolutely.
Thank you so much,
And
Nate.
thanks so much for having me here. And I will just want to say that the work of the Helsinki Commission and what's being done is so important. This is a bipartisan, bicameral. It is. This issue should not be politicized, political. This is an American issue, and I appreciate the leadership on all sides coming together and to continue to carry a strong voice.
Thank you so much, Nate. We're going to clip this, and this is going to be on YouTube Shorts.
Oh,
thank you. No, thank you so much, man.
Awesome.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.